Welcome to part 2 of Hearn and Sports. And in part 2, we're going to look at Hearn's relation to Kyudo, or Japanese archery, and Judo. Okay. As I've told you, he was interested in 2 sports. The other one, Judo, was at Hearn's time called Jujutsu. And as you probably know, it was very famous as a sport in the 5th high school with Kano Jigoro as its leader. Okay, let's look at these sports in turn. First, let's look at Kyudo. Hearn became interested in Kyudo in May of 1894, so he was already in Kumamoto for several years. And he practiced it at his second home, Nishihoribata Machi in Tsuboi-machi, Nishihoribata Tsuboi-machi. Why did Hearn start to practice Kyudo after several years in Kumamoto? One reason is that his father-in-law was his instructor. His father-in-law was quite adept at Kyudo. As a samurai, he was trained in arms from his youth. And another reason is that the house in Nishihoribata had a very long private garden where Hearn could practice without being seen. He was very aware of eyes on him, and he didn't want to embarrass himself by being watched without his skill. Here's a letter that Hearn wrote to Chamberlain, and it's very interesting. P.S. I've been trying to shoot with a bow. The shape of the Japanese bow is peculiar compared to a Western bow. It is. And it's not held as our bows are. It's held near the bottom and is hard to use. The bottom part is wider than the top. And the thing is tremendously long. I think mine is fully 9 feet. My father-in-law, trained in arms in his youth, is expert with it. I can scarcely do anything with it, but he is teaching me. Okay, now, what is interesting about this letter is that it's wrong. There are 2 big mistakes, misconceptions. The bottom part of the bow is not wider than the top. It's the other way around. It's narrower. So the sketch that he has drawn is upside down. And secondly, his bow is almost certainly not 9 feet long. 2.7 meters is 9 feet, but the standard length of a Kyudo or Japanese archery bow has long been 2.2 meters, quite a bit shorter, slightly over 7 feet long. Okay, this is typical Hearn. He starts something and he writes about it and then later realizes he's made some basic mistakes. So the next letter, he corrects it. I'm sorry, I drew the position of the bow upside down. Okay, but he got a slightly smaller bow, and he introduces an interesting idea, that in the middle. It struck me the difference in the English and Japanese bows illustrates something of character. You remember what a straight, dense, strong, I can't even read that, frank thing the English bow is, but the Japanese bow is not. Unstrung, it is twisted like a snake, and strung, its shape is all awry, yet in proportion to weight, I think it is stronger. The shape is marvelously cunning. Okay, he introduces an interesting idea here that he is to develop in many essays about Japan. However, he's practicing, but he feels afraid of the bow, especially since he is blind in one eye and severely myopic in the other eye. So, of course, he would feel afraid. I would feel safer shooting with a revolver, a pistol. which I know how to manage, but I shall try. I imagine for most Japanese people, it's interesting that Hearn feels a pistol is a safer weapon to use than a Japanese bow. Okay, now, why Kyudo? One reason, Kyudo is cool. By cool, I mean not like cool Japan, but cool because you don't sweat. Okay, I recommend it because of its coolness compared with tennis or cricket. The chest, back, and arm muscles are fully exercised, but the body has to be kept steady and one does not feel heated. When Hearn sweat, then a wind came, he would get chill and he would have lung trouble. He really disliked sweaty sports such as tennis. Okay, but as his next letters reveal, he's not making much progress. I found it was difficult, fearfully difficult, to hit a paper lantern at night. So in Hearn's garden at night, his father-in-law is shooting at a lantern. Hearn tries it, but he can't do it. An interesting point here, let me try to use this laser pen. Can't see it very well, but my father-in-law is really expert. He can hit it at the first or second shot. So after he's finished, then after I try, then he does it. I introduced before the question of why would Hearn take up Kyudo? Well, one reason, as I said, it was cool and sweatless. Used upper body muscles. As a swimmer, a long-time swimmer, Hearn's arms and shoulders and back were quite strong, or at least he says so. And so Kyudo used the same muscles. Hearn would have felt very comfortable with such a sport. Also, and this is important, it was a very popular pastime with his colleagues. Many of the teachers after classes or on a weekend would go to the Kyudo practice area, and they had parties afterwards. I think Hearn wanted to be in their company, wanted to be one of the guys. So Kyudo was a good way to make friends. And his father-in-law could teach him. He had an expert teacher and a private teacher. So he would not be embarrassed if he made his debut with the Japanese colleagues. But the most important and compelling reason may have been none of those, but cross-cultural comparison. As I read before, the straight, dense, strong, frank English bow is to be contrasted with the Japanese bow, which is twisted like a snake, and which is very light, but has more power than the English bow. Let's just remind ourselves that an English bow in the 19th century is like the man on the left. It is a perfectly straight thing, and even thicker. Of course, the Japanese bow is thinner and has a curve here, and then another curve here, wider and thinner. So Hearn calls this a snake-like curve, and he finds that this snake-like curve, compared to the straight line, is a key to understanding the difference between Oriental culture and Western culture. Okay. Well, how did Hearn's how did Hearn progress with Kyudo? After Kumamoto, there is no mention. He moved to Kobe, never discusses it. Maybe he had no place to practice. Maybe he just thought it was not for him. He was not suitable. But for whatever reason, his deep experience with Japanese archery ended after a few months in Kumamoto. Now, The next sport that Hearn was also interested in, another Japanese sport, and another sport that he was introduced to in Kumamoto, was judo. Of course, it was Kano Jigoro, the father of judo, who was the head of the 5th high school when Hearn arrived, and he offered to teach Hearn anything he wanted to know about it. The idea of it fascinated Hearn. To conquer not by strength, but by yielding, by softness. Now, Hearn never actually tried it. He says in a letter, to practice it, you have to be born in Japan. But he wrote a very long essay about it. Okay, why? To introduce cross-cultural differences. The Occidental or Western mind versus the Oriental mind. And the important point here is at the bottom. The Occidental mind appears to work in straight lines. The Oriental in wonderful curves and circles. Okay. Now it's interesting, he doesn't say much about Jiu-Jitsu's physical aspects. Rather, he is intrigued by the metaphysical and cross-cultural aspects of it. So that's what the essay is about. Now, Kyudo and Judo had a very common point. They both use curves and circles to get more power and grace with less effort and lighter tools. The lighter, more clever, and more efficient East will have an economic advantage over the heavier West. So the West is like a dinosaur, too big, too heavy. In fact, this came true when Japan started exporting Japanese cars to the US. They could run just as fast on far less fuel, much more economical, and no loss in power. This is the same as the Japanese bow and the idea of judo. You don't need power to achieve a result. So, to conclude, from his experience with Kyudo and Judo, and it's interesting that both of these Japanese sports Hearn became aware of in Kumamoto. Hearn greatly deepened his understanding of Eastern culture in general and Japanese culture in particular. It was like swimming. The insights he gained would later influence and color his writing about Japan. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.